They read my name out loud at the county courthouse and declared me legally incompetent, as if I were already buried 6 feet under, while my only son, Eric Kane, stood there smiling like he had just won a promotion. I was 76 years old. Walter Kane, once a Marine, later a construction inspector, and I had spent my life building homes, roads, and bridges that kept other people safe. Yet in that moment, before a judge, my own blood painted me as a man who could no longer recognize his own reflection. Eric, my only child, was a sharp-looking man in his 40s, with the kind of suit that cost more than my monthly pension check. He was ambitious, calculating, and determined to rise higher, no matter whose shoulders he had to stand on. He leaned into the microphone and declared to the room that his father was slipping fast, that I had forgotten where I lived, that I had signed documents without knowing what they were. He said it with a smooth voice, steady, confident, as though he were reading gospel. The audience of strangers, court clerks, and neighbors shifted uncomfortably, while I sat there in silence, my fists clenched, because in that moment I understood my son wasn't here to protect me. He was here to strip me of everything I had. Left, I had buried my wife 10 years earlier and had been alone since, clinging to the home we built together in the quiet suburbs of Virginia. That house, with its creaking porch and fading white paint, was the last monument to a life I had earned with sweat, blood, and the sacrifices of long nights away from my family so Eric could have every opportunity I never had. And now he stood in front of me, telling the world that I was unfit to manage it. The judge looked over her glasses and asked if I understood what was happening. My tongue felt heavy, not because I was confused, but because I had no words to describe the humiliation of being called useless in front of strangers. Eric slid a paper across the table. "It's for your own good, Dad," he said, his eyes steady but cold. He wanted my signature, the last step before he could seize control of my bank account, the deed to my home, even the pension checks that came each month from the government. I refused to touch the pen. My knuckles whitened around the armrest of the chair, a chair they had given me as if I needed help just to sit. Eric leaned closer. "You don't want to make a scene. People already think you're slipping. Just sign it." He said it softly, but every word was a knife. I thought of the men I had served with decades earlier. Names etched into my old military notebook, some crossed out because they never came home. I thought of the long winters I had worked double shifts on job sites, climbing steel beams with my back aching, just so Eric could go to college. My sacrifices weren't carved on marble, but they lived in the calluses of my hands, in the wrinkles, across my face, in the roof that still stood over our heads. To see my own son erasing all of that with a single performance in a courtroom cut deeper than anything I had ever faced. When the hearing adjourned, the judge didn't make a ruling yet, but she ordered a medical evaluation. Eric walked out ahead of me, shaking hands with people he knew, as if he had already won. I followed, slowly, staring at his back, realizing for the first time that the boy I had raised was gone. What remained was a man who saw me as an obstacle, not a father. Outside the courthouse, a small group of reporters waited. I didn't even know Eric had tipped them off. One asked if I had any comment on the petition for guardianship. Another shoved a camera into my face. I wanted to shout, to tell them I wasn't broken, but the words caught in my throat. Eric stepped in front of me, raising his hands like a protective son. "No comment," he said. Then he guided me to the car. The picture of a caring child escorting his frail father. To the cameras, it looked tender. To me, It was betrayal carved into stone. In the car ride home, he spoke calmly, like a banker reassuring a client. "Dad, this is going to make your life easier. No more worrying about bills. No more stress about the house. I'll handle it." All. His voice was sugar-coated poison. I didn't answer. My silence was my shield, but inside, the anger burned. When we pulled up to the house, he didn't even come in. He handed me the keys, told me to get some rest, and promised he'd come by tomorrow with important papers. Then he drove away in his gleaming black sedan, leaving me standing on the porch of the house I had built with my bare hands. The wood under my feet creaked, old but strong, just like me. I pressed my palm against the railing, feeling the grain, reminding myself of what was real. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with the single bulb casting long shadows across the room. I pulled out my old notebook, the one I had carried since the war. The leather was cracked, the ink faded, but the names of the men I had served with were still there, each letter etched with care. I flipped through it, steadying my breath. This notebook was more than paper. It was proof of memory, proof of life, proof that I was not the broken shell my son claimed I was. I thought of Eric again, his smug smile, his confidence that the world would believe him over me. And why wouldn't they? He was young, polished, successful. I was an old man with shaky hands and thinning hair, living alone in a house that looked like it belonged in another decade. But I knew something he didn't. You don't survive war. You don't survive years of hard labor and sacrifice without learning patience. The betrayal in the courtroom was just the beginning. I could feel it in my bones. He wanted everything, my house, my money, my dignity, and he thought I was too weak to fight back. But as I closed the notebook, my fingers lingering on the last page, I whispered to the empty kitchen, "You made one mistake, Eric. You forgot who taught you to fight." Sleep didn't come easy that night. Every sound of the house echoed. The ticking clock, the creak of the stairs, the hum of the refrigerator. Each reminded me of how much I had built and how quickly it could be stolen. But beneath the ache of betrayal, there was a rising steel inside me, the same steel that had carried me through foxholes and scaffolds. Eric thought he was writing the end of my story. He had no idea it was only the first chapter. The ring light was already on when I walked into my own kitchen, and my daughter-in-law, Sophie McCain, an online personality who lived by the glow of screens and the bite of captions, had arranged my breakfast like a movie set. The cereal box faced out, the milk sat at the edge of the counter with its cap loosened, and my old veteran cap sun-faded, sweat-salted, had been placed just so on the table. She stood behind the phone on a tripod and lifted her hands as if conducting a small orchestra. She said we were going to show people how families cared for their elders. The light burned into my eyes. I told her I didn't want the camera. She smiled the kind of smile that doesn't reach the bones and said people needed my story. The milk spilled on the second pour. The cap spun off into the sink, and the white spread across the wood like a slow map, and somewhere in the device, a counter ticked up. She moved quickly with a towel, too quickly for someone caught off guard, cooing to the invisible audience about patience and dignity and the little messes that meant so much. She filmed my hands, not my face, as if hands were permission enough. When she lifted the towel for the camera, I saw the words she had embroidered along the hem. Take care, don't stare, be kind. It wasn't new. She had planned this. She introduced herself to the feed with the practiced tone of someone selling a morning ritual. She introduced me as a man whose memories arrived like birds at a winter feeder, irregular and delicate, and she said we were learning together. She described how hard it was to keep up with bills and appointments, how grateful she was for a community that stood with caregivers. She turned the phone toward the counter just as I reached for my military notebook, the one I had left on the chair where I always put it. It wasn't there. She told the viewers she would share a link for people who wanted to help, and she touched my elbow as if I were a piece of glassware. She said we were blessed. Eric had coached her. I could hear his cadence in the words that came from her mouth, strong and reasonable, and always pointing toward a conclusion that benefited him. He had called me the night before, speaking like a man trying to sell life insurance, laying out how the internet could make things easier. He said brand partnerships could cover care. He said sharing our journey would create a support system. He said I would be seen. He meant I would be packaged. Sophie kept filming through the morning. She asked me to open a bottle of vitamins that she had sealed too tight. She asked me to read a label she had replaced with a blank sticker. She asked me to tie a shoelace. She had already double-knotted. Each time, she captured a small failure, then framed it as courage. The comments blinked across the screen like sleet on a windshield. People applauded. People cried. People said their grandparents had the same disease, and they were praying for me. People asked where to donate when the delivery came up. Box stacked with sample products from a home care brand. Sophie clapped like a child who had won a carnival prize. She positioned the box on the table and arranged the contents. Adult wipes, pill organizers, a bracelet with a GPS tag disguised as a medical ID. She said we were partnering to raise awareness. She said the company was committed to kindness. She slipped the bracelet around my wrist as if it were a gift. I told her I didn't need a tracker. She said it made everyone feel safer. She didn't ask. I found the notebook in the laundry room under a basket of towels, and the edges of the leather were damp from the spill. I laid it open on the dryer to breathe. The pages curled as they dried, and a halo of milk splotches spread across one list of names. I traced each letter with a finger until the paper grew warm beneath my hand. Sophie called from the kitchen to tell me we had hit a milestone. She said a morning show had messaged her account, asking if we'd come on to talk about the realities of caring for aging parents. I closed the notebook and slid it inside my jacket. When I stepped out onto the porch, the world felt smaller, as if the camera had narrowed the street to a frame. The mailman lifted his hand, then lowered it. A neighbor across the way stared, then looked down, then took a photo. The phone vibrated in my pocket with a message from Eric, telling me not to make any sudden decisions and reminding me about the medical evaluation. He said he was proud of how I had handled the hearing, like a compliment for a child. I set my jaw and walked toward the bus stop at the grocery store. The automatic doors sighed open and the cold air hit my face. Sophie had insisted on coming, saying she wanted to document a normal day. She spoke loudly to her followers as we moved down the aisles. She explained how confusing a supermarket could be for someone who mixed up brands and dates, and she pushed the cart like a stroller. My steps felt measured, deliberately unhurried, because speed looked like competence on camera, and she wasn't looking for competence. We stopped at the dairy case, where cartons rode, like soldiers in formation. I read the labels. I picked one with tomorrow's date so I would know my choice was fresh. She held her phone low to catch my hands. She narrated how I tended to grab the wrong milk, how she would gently correct me. The manager of the store, A man in his 50s with a name tag that read Carlos walked over. He asked if we were filming. He looked at me, not at her, and asked if I was comfortable being on camera. I told him I wasn't. He nodded once, the kind of nod a man gives when he has already decided what to do. And he told Sophie that she could not record customers without permission. She switched to a tone that had worked on brands and followers. And my son, she spoke about advocacy. She spoke about raising awareness and building empathy. She said she was documenting her father-in-law's condition for educational purposes. The manager said the store had rules. He said consent mattered. He said it wasn't right to turn a private moment into a performance. Sophie put her free. Hand on her hip. A small circle formed around us, employees hovering, a few shoppers pretending to compare prices while they watched. I felt my heart slow to a pace I recognized from long ago, a steady beat that made room for clear thinking. I told the manager I appreciated his concern. He surprised me. He placed a hand over his chest for the briefest second, a small gesture. He might not have even realized he was making, and he said his father had served. He said he had learned to honor a man's word. He turned to Sophie and asked her to put the phone away. She did, not because she agreed, but because she understood how she would look if she kept arguing. The circle dissolved. An employee quietly offered to carry my groceries. I declined and lifted the basket myself. Sophie sulked through the produce. She called Eric and put him on speaker without asking. He asked if we had filmed a good segment. He asked why the cart wasn't full yet. He told her not to let anyone make her feel small. The manager's eyes met mine again across the aisle. He gave the smallest shrug, the kind a man gives when he has done what he can. I realized this was the kind of help available to me now. Thin, necessary lines held by strangers. I would take them. The post went up that afternoon anyway. Not the store confrontation, but a different edit from the kitchen, complete with gentle piano music and a caption about courage in the face of decline. The views climbed. My phone pinged with unknown numbers and unknown names. Cousins I hadn't heard from in years texted condolences for a living man. A local church sent a message offering to include me in their prayer list. One video clip showed my hands trembling slightly as I placed a spoon next to a bowl. The text across the image read, "When his hands forget, hold his heart." My face never appeared. My stories did not belong to me. A UPS truck stopped where it never stopped, and the driver hauled 2 more boxes to the porch. More care products, a weighted blanket, a reminder clock made for people who forgot whether it was morning or evening. Sophie opened everything and arranged it along the mantel, the same mantel where my wife's photographs had once stood. The blanket spilled over a framed picture, and she didn't move it back. She announced to her followers that she would unbox helpful tools for anyone dealing with a loved one in the same situation. People thanked her in the comments. A brand representative messaged her with a contract. I watched her type my name onto a form that she said would streamline samples and allow monetization. She explained that it would help offset costs. She paused, asked if she should write Walt or Walter, then decided she knew best. She wore that bracelet of good intentions like armor, and she moved through my living room as if she had been elected to steward it. She had not. Eric arrived with a new phone for me, a large one with big icons, preloaded with an app that allowed them to see where I was at all times. He said it would give everyone peace of mind. He reset the passcode without telling me. He showed me how to use it, his finger moving too fast for my eyes to follow, and he deleted the contacts he thought I didn't need. He hid the banking app and told me he had connected my account to an auto-pay system so I wouldn't have to worry about bills. He called it progress. I noticed other changes. The front door lock had been replaced with a keypad that could be controlled. From their phones, the keys I carried no longer worked. The calendar on the refrigerator had new appointments scribbled in Sophie's handwriting. Evaluation, caregiver, consult, equipment delivery. She had added a recurring slot for content planning. Neighbors, who used to ask about my tomatoes, now asked how I was holding up. And they spoke slowly, as if careful words could keep a man from shattering. A man I had once helped fix a fence told me I was lucky to have such a devoted family. Another neighbor tugged their child away when the boy reached for my sleeve to see the bracelet, the one that blinked when I moved too far from the living room. Sophie insisted on keeping the house bright at night for better lighting. The shadows in my hallway dissolved into a constant glow. I learned the new landscape by sound, the tripod legs scraping on the hardwood, the ring light clicking, the whisper of Sophie's scripted encouragement as she taped another segment. The moral line had been drawn at the grocery store, but at home it blurred. After dinner, Sophie uploaded a clip of me standing in the backyard, the flag clipping the air above me. She slowed the footage so it looked like I was chasing a memory that wouldn't land. The caption said I had saluted the birds because I thought they were friends from long ago. I had lifted my chin because the wind changed and the scent of cut grass came up from the yard and brought with it a fragment of a different summer. She rewrote it as a symptom. Strangers filled the comments with hearts and folded hands. That night, I moved through my house like it had turned into a museum, with a guide I hadn't hired. I hid the notebook in a place where the camera could not go, the one cupboard that creaked in a way Sophie hated because the sound ruined her audio. I wrote down the names again that the milk had blurred, pressing harder this time so the letters cut into the paper. I made a list of what had changed. The lock, the phone, the passcode, the calendar, the bracelet, the placement of the cap on the milk. I wrote the word consent and circled it. I wrote the name Carlos and underlined it twice. I woke before dawn and walked to the end of the block while the bracelet blinked uselessly in the dark. The sky above the houses held on to the last of the night, and a thin line of light sat on. The horizon like a promise. A jogger passed and nodded. The early people are always kinder. I reached the little park at the corner and sat on a bench that had been dedicated to a woman I didn't know. A name carved into metal with dates on either side, proof that someone had decided she mattered. My own name felt like it had been stamped onto content. No dates, no context, no matter. By mid-morning, the video had crossed some threshold that made algorithms bow in service to it. Sophie's phone chimed in bursts, and mine buzzed with notifications I didn't ask for. She said a talk show wanted us that very week. She said a non-profit for caregivers had offered to send a team for a feature. She said brands were reaching out to do a campaign about compassion. She laid out clothes on my bed that she thought looked more grandfatherly. She took my cap and steamed it to remove the sweat ring. She redrew my life for better optics. I called the VA clinic to confirm the date of my routine checkup. The receptionist asked if I needed a ride and referred to me by a different last name. I corrected her. She apologized and said my file had notes from an external physician about cognitive decline. My file, external physician. The words hung in the air like a warning siren. I wrote them down in the notebook with my slow, careful hand. Before dinner, Sophie returned the notebook to the coffee table and placed a small vase of fresh flowers beside it. She told her followers the book helped anchor me. She never opened it. She used it like a prop, a symbol that meant compassion. When photographed from above, she filmed my hands resting on the leather and spoke about memory as if it were a soft thing that could be cradled. She uploaded a close-up of my knuckles, scarred from steel and years, and captioned it with a line about time carving stories into skin. People felt moved. People said they would be there for us. People sent money through a button she added to her profile. That evening, I walked back to the grocery store. I wanted to thank the manager for looking me in the eye when everyone else looked at their screens. He was busy restocking a shelf, and he didn't recognize me at first without the camera around. When he did, he nodded the same nod. He said his father had kept a ledger of names too, from his own life, and he kept it even after the funeral because it helped him remember what mattered. He said no one could give consent for another man's dignity. He went back to work, quiet as before. I left with a small bag of coffee and the certainty that a single sentence spoken plainly could weigh more than 1,000 comments. When I returned home, the living room was lit up, and a soft box light hummed. The bracelet blinked a red I had not seen, and my phone asked for a passcode it would not accept. Sophie and Eric were on the couch, discussing a plan for the medical evaluation and how best to present symptoms without alarming the clinicians. They didn't notice me at first. They were editing a list. They were building a version of me that would pass muster. They were making it easy for everyone to nod along. I stood in the doorway and watched the reflection of the ring light in the window, a perfect circle that made everything in the glass look staged. In the pocket of my jacket, the notebook pressed against my ribs, heavy and real. The house I had built could be refitted with tripods. Locks could be changed and passcodes reassigned. But I still knew the smell of rain when it collected in the gutter beside the porch. I still knew the rhythm of my own steps on the stairs. I still knew the names in my book without looking. And as that knowledge moved through me like a current, I understood what had to happen next. The camera would not be the only witness. The first time I saw Harper that week, she was standing in the driveway with headphones in, bouncing one foot against the asphalt while staring at a screen that looked brighter than the sky above her. She was 16, all restless energy and sharp edges. And she was the only one who sometimes broke the rhythm of control that Eric and Sophie kept pressing around me. When she caught my eyes, she pulled the headphones down, walked closer, and whispered like she was passing contraband, "Grandpa, you should see this." She slipped her phone into my palm and tilted it just enough so I could watch without the neighbors noticing. On the screen was a clip Sophie had uploaded, one I hadn't known she filmed. It showed me fumbling with a shoelace I had already tied, set to soft piano music. The caption read, "When his mind drifts, hold his heart steady." The comments poured in like an avalanche, hearts, prayers, digital applause. I watched myself move, in slow motion, manipulated into a story I hadn't agreed to. Harper's jaw clenched. "They're lying about you," she said. "They're making you look like you're not even here." She dragged me inside before I could answer. In her room, posters covered the walls, some peeling at the corners, and a desk lamp hummed in the corner. She pulled open a drawer and lifted my notebook. "They tried to take this," she said, her eyes hard. "I kept it safe." She flipped it open, her fingers tracing the names written in ink. "I know this matters to you. They don't get to decide what's real." I studied her face, the stubborn set of her mouth, the fire that reminded me of soldiers I had once marched beside. For the first time in weeks, I felt a surge of something stronger than anger. recognition. Harper believed me, or at least she wanted to. She asked me questions about the names in the notebook. I told her stories, not all of them, but enough for her to see that memory lived inside me like steel, not like sand. She nodded, eyes wide, absorbing every word. Later that night, I heard raised voices downstairs. Eric and Sophie were talking in sharp tones. I leaned near the staircase, the wood cool under my bare feet. Sophie said Harper had been too close to me, that she was undermining their narrative. Eric hissed that it didn't matter as long as the paperwork moved forward. Then he said the words that punched through me like a blunt blade. She learned. Everyone has a price. The next morning, Harper was different. Her smile was thinner, her movements rehearsed. She avoided my eyes. As we sat in the kitchen while Sophie arranged props for another video, after breakfast, she pulled me aside. She said her parents had offered her something big, the chance to study abroad, something she had dreamed of since middle school. She said the only way they'd agree was if she gave them my notebook. She looked at me like she wanted me to say no, like she wanted me to fight her battle for her. But she was 16, and dreams weigh heavier than loyalty when the world keeps telling you family is negotiable. Told her the notebook wasn't just mine. It belonged to men who had bled beside me. 2 lives cut short in jungles and deserts. 2 nights when we didn't know if the sun would rise again. She shifted, her lips trembling. For a second, she was the granddaughter who used to sit on my knee and ask for stories about the old days. Then she tightened her grip and whispered, "I'm sorry, Grandpa." By evening, the notebook was gone. Sophie filmed Harper handing it over, painting it as a sweet moment of keeping Grandpa's memories safe. She turned the camera to herself and spoke about how important it was for families to work together during decline. Harper stood beside her, eyes glossy but locked on the lens, as if she was already practicing for the wider stage her parents had promised. I stood just outside the frame, watching the pages that carried my life vanish into their hands. That night, I searched the house for where they might have hidden it. Drawers, closets, cabinets. I moved through the rooms quietly, listening for footsteps. I found nothing, but on the counter lay a folder, half open, with papers inside. I pulled it closer and saw my name scrawled across the top of legal documents. Power of attorney, guardianship, transfer. My signature forged in the steady hand of my son. The air in my chest turned thick. My pulse slowed, the same way it had slowed when I was a young man holding a rifle, waiting for a command. Betrayal wasn't a moment anymore, it was an institution, signed, dated, and filed. I folded the papers back, careful not to leave a mark. I returned them exactly where they had been. Then I went to my room and sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the spot on the wall where the paint had faded from years of sunlight. I whispered the names in the notebook, one by one, forcing myself to recall each syllable. I would not let them erase me, even if they took every scrap of paper. The next day, Harper avoided me. She sat at the table with her phone, scrolling, laughing at videos I couldn't see. When she finally looked up, her eyes slid past mine. She had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. In her world, opportunity had outweighed blood. In mine, the wound of her betrayal cut deeper than steel. I walked outside and stood by the porch, staring at the horizon. The house felt smaller than ever, not because of its size, but because of the walls closing in with their lies. For a long time, I had thought patience was my shield. But standing there, listening to Sophie's voice through the open window as she recorded another monologue, about the challenges of dementia care. I realized patience alone would bury me. That night I lay awake, tracing scars on my hands. Each one a story they couldn't spin. Harper's betrayal burned, not because she was cruel, but because she was young and they had bought her with promises. That was how the next generation was built. Now not on sacrifice, but on contracts. I swore to myself in the dark that if they wanted to erase me, they would have to fight every inch of the way. They thought they had silenced me with a stolen notebook. They hadn't seen what lived inside me still. The appointment with Dr. Patel was scheduled for a grey Thursday morning, and Eric insisted on driving me himself. He said it was easier that way, that parking near the clinic was a hassle, but I knew the real reason. He wanted to control the story. Sophie rode along in the back seat, phone in hand, whispering into her camera about the importance of regular checkups for loved ones struggling with memory decline. Her voice filled the car while the rain tapped against the windshield in restless rhythms. I sat still, my hands folded over my knees, watching the highway signs blur past. Eric spoke to me like a coach prepping his team before a game. Just answer what he asks, Dad. Don't overthink. If you don't remember something, that's fine. It's natural. We're all here to help. He glanced sideways at me, then tightened his grip on the steering wheel. His tone was calm, but I could hear the urgency underneath. The clinic smelled of disinfectant and wet umbrellas. Dr. Patel was a man I had known for years, with a warm handshake and an accent that softened every word. He greeted me by name, not by patient ID, and asked how the tomatoes in my garden had done last summer. For a moment, it felt ordinary. But then Eric stepped in, eager to steer the conversation. He listed the supposed lapses I had had lately, exaggerated versions of everyday slips. He spoke about lost keys, misplaced mail, and names that didn't come fast enough. He made it sound like my mind was leaking through cracks. Sophie nodded along, capturing a few discreet photos with her phone, angling the lens so it looked like she was only texting. Dr. Patel sat across from me, his notepad balanced on one knee. He asked me simple questions at first: the date, the season, the name of the president. I answered cleanly. Then he asked me to recall 3 words he listed at the start of our conversation. I repeated them without hesitation. Eric shifted uncomfortably, then cut in to remind the doctor about how I had forgotten to turn off the stove one evening. I corrected him. I had left a kettle on low heat, and I had caught it myself before it boiled dry. The doctor scribbled a note. I leaned slightly forward, enough for my eyes to catch his, and held his gaze. He paused, his pen hovering above the paper. Then he moved on. He asked me to draw a clock face. I sketched the circle, marked the numbers, and placed the hands at the time he requested. My lines wavered slightly, the tremor of age, but the face was clear. When the exam ended, Dr. Patel excused himself to step into his office. Eric followed, him whispering, pressing his case. I remained in the chair, Sophie watching me closely as if waiting for me to drift off into confusion. Instead, I kept my back straight and my eyes sharp. When the door opened again, Patel's expression was unreadable. He handed Eric a sealed envelope and said he would send the full report in a few days. On the drive home, Eric was unusually quiet. He tapped the envelope against his thigh, his jaw tight. Sophie tried to lighten the mood, talking about dinner plans, about a new sponsorship inquiry she had received. I sat in silence, staring out at the wet streets, thinking of the notebook that was no longer mine and the test I had just passed. knowing that truth meant little if it was filtered through someone else's story. 3 nights later, I found the report lying on the counter. Eric had left it there, perhaps confident I wouldn't notice. I waited until the house was still, then opened it carefully. The words were clear: mild cognitive concerns consistent with aging, but not evidence of dementia at this time. My chest tightened. Relief, yes, but also suspicion. I scanned further. At the bottom, in Patel's tight script, there was a sentence. That didn't belong. Recommend guardianship consideration due to increasing family concerns. It was a contradiction folded neatly into official paper. I studied the signature. Patel's handwriting had always been precise, but the loop in his last letter was unusual, almost hesitant. I read it again and saw what he had done. In one place, he had listed my memory as intact. In another, he had given Eric the ammunition he wanted. And yet, by writing it this way, he had left the door open. A contradiction could be challenged. A contradiction could be exploited. The next morning, Eric confronted me with the report. He spoke as if it was the final verdict, the proof he had been waiting for. It's all here, Dad. The doctor sees it too. This isn't about control. It's about protecting you. His voice was steady, but his eyes gleamed with triumph. Sophie recorded a short clip, talking about how hard it was to hear the truth, but how grateful she was for professionals who cared. I looked at the paper again and nodded slowly, letting them believe I was resigned. Inside, my mind was sharp with calculation. Patel had not betrayed me fully. He had built a file that could be bent in 2 directions. If Eric thought it sealed my fate, he was wrong. Later that week, I visited the clinic alone. I took the bus, moving quietly, no bracelet on my wrist, this time because I had slipped it off in the early morning hours. When I walked into Patel's office, he looked up in surprise. I placed the report on his desk. I asked him if he truly believed I was incapable. He leaned back in his chair, folded his hands, and spoke carefully. He said he had seen many families, twist stories to their advantage, and he had learned that sometimes the safest way to write was to leave a shadow of doubt in both directions. Your son asked me for certainty, he said. I gave him ambiguity. Do with it what you will. I left the office with the report tucked inside my jacket, my steps slow but steady. The air outside felt sharper, the sky stretched wider. Eric thought he held all the cards, but now I knew. Different. I had a weapon he didn't understand. The truth, disguised as contradiction. That night, Sophie posted another video, talking about the bravery it took to face medical confirmation. She cried on camera, her tears falling perfectly under the soft light. Eric stood behind her, a pillar of strength. The comments flooded in, calling them heroes. I sat in my chair, the report folded tight in my hand, listening to their performance. My face was absent from the screen, my story written by others. But I held the paper, and in its lines of careful handwriting, I saw a crack in their wall. Thought of the men in my notebook, of nights in foreign fields when survival depended on reading the smallest sign, a footprint, a shadow, a change in the air. Patel had given me a sign. My son believed he had one, but he had only set the stage, and as I sat there, the glow of Sophie's ring light painting false halos across the room, I promised myself that one day soon I would tear the curtain from their theatre and make the world see who I really was. The first whispers reached me at the diner. I had stopped in for coffee, the kind of place where old men still sat in booths talking about weather and politics. like it was the heartbeat of the town. But when I walked past the counter, I noticed two women lower their voices. One leaned toward the other and said, "That's him." The words landed on my shoulders heavier than the steaming mug I carried to my table. They didn't look at me directly, but their eyes lingered and their mouths tightened. I sipped the coffee, bitter and too hot, and pretended not to hear. On the way home, the stares followed. A neighbor waved half-heartedly, then whispered to the woman beside him as soon as I turned. A teenager laughed and muttered something I didn't catch, but the sound carried the edge of cruelty. By the time I reached my porch, the silence of my house felt like a shield. I thought maybe I was imagining it. But the next day, the whispers grew louder. It was Martha Reynolds who gave them shape. She lived 2 doors down, a widow who had never missed a chance to comment on the state of other people's lives. She had always been sharp-tongued, but never malicious until now. I found her at the fence line, speaking to another neighbor, her voice pitched just high enough for me to hear. "He wasn't the hero everyone thinks," she said. "He left his wife for months at a time, and not just for work." There was another woman. "Ask anyone." The other neighbor frowned, unsure whether to believe it. Martha nodded, as if sealing a truth. "That's why his son has to take care of everything now. He can't be trusted, never could." My chest felt hollow, the air pulled out of me. I wanted to shout, to demand where she had heard such poison, but I already knew. Eric had found a new weapon, not just my supposed illness, but a story that painted me as unworthy long before age touched me. He wasn't just trying to take my house. He was rewriting my life. The rumors spread fast. At the grocery store, a clerk who had once asked me about fishing spots avoided my eyes. At church, a man I had worked alongside on a volunteer build greeted me stiffly, his smile brittle. Even the mailman hesitated before stepping onto my porch. Every look carried a question I hadn't earned. Had I betrayed my family? Had I abandoned my wife? Was I the man they claimed? That night, Sophie posted another video, this one different from her usual polished clips. It was raw, dimly lit, showing her eyes red as if she had been crying. She spoke about the challenges of caring for someone whose past mistakes resurfaced. How hard it was to stay compassionate when old wounds bled into the present. She never named me directly, but she didn't need to. Her audience filled in the blanks. The comments poured in with sympathy for her, for Eric, for Harper. Strangers told them to stay strong, that no one could blame them for protecting themselves. My name had become a shadow in their narrative, a man defined by gossip and half-truths. I sat alone at the kitchen table, the notebook gone, the house quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. I thought of my wife, of the years she had stood by me through deployments and long shifts. I had never betrayed her, never once. And yet, in the mouths of my neighbors, I was suddenly an adulterer, a deserter of my own family. That was the cruelty of lies. They didn't need proof, only repetition. The next morning, Martha confronted me directly. She stood on the sidewalk as I walked to get the mail, her hands on her hips. "People deserve to know the truth," she said. "Eric told me what you did to your wife. You think we didn't notice when you disappeared all those nights? We just didn't talk about it then." Her eyes glittered with the satisfaction of someone who believed they were finally unmasking a fraud. I clenched the mail in my hands. There were no words that would pierce her certainty. Eric had fed her a script, and she had swallowed it whole. I walked past her without speaking, the envelopes crumpling under my grip. Behind me, she called, "Out, Your son is doing the right thing. He's fixing what you broke." In the following days, invitations stopped. A community meeting I usually attended went on without me. A card game I had been part of for years suddenly dissolved when I showed up. Even the pastor at church spoke in vague terms about sin and forgiveness, his eyes lingering on me longer than they should have. My world, already small, was shrinking into isolation. At home, Eric acted as though nothing had changed. He came by with paperwork, smiling in that careful way, telling me not to worry about what people said. "You know how small towns are," he said. "Stories get around. Best to ignore them." His voice was calm, but I could see the flicker of triumph in his eyes. He wanted me weakened not just in body, but in spirit. He wanted me to doubt myself. Sophie kept filming, framing me as the silent figure in the background while she spoke. About resilience, Harper avoided me altogether, her guilt too fresh, her loyalty already bought. And outside, Martha made sure the fire stayed lit, retelling the story with new details each time, making it sound more certain with every retelling. One evening, I stood at the window and watched Martha in her yard, speaking to a group of neighbors. Her arms moved as she gestured, her voice carrying across the quiet street. They nodded, leaning closer. I realized then that Eric hadn't needed to convince the whole town. He only needed one voice willing to shout loud enough, and the rest would follow. I returned to the table and pulled out the report from Dr. Patel. The contradiction stared back at me, one line affirming my memory, another suggesting guardianship. I thought of the men whose names had filled my notebook, men who had depended on me to hold the line. I couldn't let their memory be buried under lies about who I was. For the first time in weeks, I felt something shift. They had taken my reputation, stolen my history, even turned my neighbors against me. But the truth was still inside me, unbroken. If they wanted to bury me in rumors, then I would dig out in daylight. I would find a way to show the world what I knew, not what they said. The next day, I walked into town with my head high. People stared, whispered, pulled away. I let them see me, not as the character Eric and Sophie had created, but as the man who refused to vanish. I didn't speak, not yet, but I was planning, because every lie they told was a rope tightening, and I had no intention of letting them hang me with it. The call came on a Sunday afternoon, unexpected after a week of silence from Eric. The voice on the other end was gravelly, familiar in a way that felt like sandpaper against memory. "Walt, that you?" For a moment, I didn't answer. It had been decades since I'd heard Max Grant, a man who had once shared foxholes and cigarettes with me in a world far away. He laughed softly when I didn't respond right away. "Knew you'd still be breathing. Always figured you'd outlast the rest of us." He said he'd seen me more, rather. He'd seen a version of me through one of Sophie's videos online. He said he didn't buy it. He remembered the man who had once counted ammunition by touch in the dark, who had fixed a busted Jeep in the middle of a firefight. "That man doesn't forget his own name," he said. He asked if I wanted to meet, and before I could think, I agreed. We met at a coffee shop downtown, one of those renovated warehouses with exposed brick and chalkboard menus. Max looked older, heavier in the middle, with hair gone to silver, but his eyes were the same sharp, restless, calculating. He leaned in across the table and said, "You've been done dirty, old friend. I can help you." I asked him what he meant. He pulled out a tablet, swiped, and showed me mock-ups of campaigns he was running. Ads, billboards. He worked in advertising now, building images that cut through noise. This is what I do, he said, tapping the screen. I take people no one notices, and I make them impossible to ignore. You want the world to see you're still sharp. I can give you that. There was a catch. There always was. He wanted to use me as part of a campaign for a veteran-focused non-profit, one he claimed was underfunded and ignored. My story, twisted into a narrative of resilience, could draw sympathy, donations, attention. They think you're broken. He said, I'll show them you're unbreakable. But I get to tell the story. I studied him the same way I used to study men on patrol watching for the twitch that gave away their intent. He believed in what he was selling, but he also believed in the profit it would bring him. His grin was just a little too wide when he spoke about brand alignment. Still, I agreed to hear him out. The first shoot happened a week later. He brought a small crew to the park, cameras disguised as casual equipment. He asked me to wear my old jacket with the faded unit patch. He filmed me sitting on a bench, flipping through an empty notebook he had provided. He told me to close my eyes as though I were remembering names. He asked me to walk slowly down a path while sunlight filtered through trees. A picture of quiet endurance. When I asked about the real notebook, the one Eric and Sophie had taken, Max shook his head. Too messy, he said. This isn't about the details. It's about the image. People don't want the complicated truth. They want a symbol. I felt the heat rise in my chest. That notebook wasn't messy. It was real, but I stayed silent because I needed him. At least for now. The campaign rolled out within days. My face appeared on local bus shelters, grainy and noble. Above the words "Honor Forgotten No More." A video circulated online, set to solemn music, showing me standing at attention in front of a flag. Donations surged for the non-profit. Max sent me numbers like battle reports, proud of the money pouring in. Eric noticed. He stormed into my house one evening, slamming the front door hard enough to rattle the glass. "What the hell are you doing?" he shouted. Sophie filmed from the corner, already spinning the confrontation into content. He waved one of the ads in my face, furious that I had stepped outside the narrative he controlled. "You're confusing people. You're making us look like liars." I told him I hadn't made him look like anything he had done that himself. His face twisted, a crack in the polished mask he wore for everyone else. He hissed that I had no idea what I was playing with, that contracts and guardianship papers were already moving forward. "You think a billboard is going to change that? You're still mine to handle." Sophie uploaded a clip that night of her crying about how hard it was when older relatives lashed out in denial. The comments flooded in, siding with her. Meanwhile, the city was plastered with my image, courtesy of Max. For a moment, I thought Max was my ally. But the deeper I looked, the more I saw his hand twisting the story for himself. He spoke about my struggle as if it belonged to him, as if my life was just another campaign to drive donations. When he introduced me at a gala, he called me a symbol of every veteran left behind, not by name, but as a product. I stood on stage under lights that burned hotter than desert sun, clapping, echoing in my ears, and realized he was using me no differently than Eric and Sophie were. After the event, I pulled him aside. I told him I wasn't anyone's mascot. His smile didn't falter. He said, "You want to win, Walt? Then you play the game. Symbols win, stories win, not men." That night, I sat in my quiet house, the echoes of applause still rattling in my skull. They had all found ways to use me, my son, my daughter-in-law, my granddaughter, my old comrade. The lies had spread, the truth had been packaged, and I was caught in the middle like a pawn on a board. But there was one thing none of them understood. I had lived through real battles. I had seen men fall, not for image, not for profit, but for each other. And I still remembered every name. Max thought he owned my story. Eric thought he owned my life. Sophie thought she owned my dignity. But they had all made the same mistake. They underestimated what an old man remembers when everyone else is trying to erase him. And as I stared at the latest billboard with my face staring back at me, I knew the time was coming to flip the script for good. The city has a pulse that never sleeps. I felt it beating under my shoes the night Max brought me into his office, glass walls reflecting the lights of New York. He spoke quickly, pointing at screens, maps, mock-ups. His company was preparing a massive rollout for a new campaign Times Square, the heart of spectacle. "This is your shot," he said. "Biggest stage in the world." He talked like a general planning a strike, his words sharp, his hands carving through the air. To him, I was ammunition. He wanted me to stand as the face of resilience, an emblem his clients could plaster 20 stories tall. People will see you up there and think, there's a man who endured, who represents us all. He was half right. I would be seen. Yes, but not on his terms. I kept my mouth shut, letting him believe he was in control. Old habits die hard, sometimes silence is the best weapon. While he explained contracts and sponsorships, I scanned every word, every document, the way I used to check blueprints for weak beams. And just like a weak beam, I spotted the flaw, a loophole buried in the agreement that gave him license to use my image, but also gave me leverage. The digital assets had to pass through me before final release. My signature required on the master file. He thought it was a formality. I saw it as a door left unlocked. At home, the house smelled of dust and quiet. The walls seemed closer now, filled with shadows cast by the lives I'd built and the family that had abandoned me. I pulled out the battered notebook they thought was worthless. My hands traced the names written inside, men who had fought beside me, men who had trusted me to keep count, to remember. I whispered the names aloud. They anchored me. They reminded me I still had a duty, though my battlefield had changed. I began my own planning. I went to a library, one of the few places Sophie and Eric would never think to track me. Among the shelves, I worked with old computers, clunky but effective. I learned how Max's team prepped their digital files, how assets were stored before the giant screens in Times Square lit them up. I scribbled notes, drew diagrams, built my own map of their process. If war had taught me anything, it was that supply lines mattered. Cut the right line, and the enemy's entire structure collapsed. Days later, I played along during another shoot. Max's crew filmed me staring solemnly at the horizon, my hands folded on my lap, my face framed in golden light. They wanted vulnerability, they wanted fragility. I gave them just enough to keep them satisfied. But inside, I was memorizing the sequence of drives, passwords, and systems they used. When Eric found out about the Times Square campaign, he exploded. He accused me of humiliating him, of making the family look like liars. He shouted that people were starting to ask questions, that the guardianship petition was stalling because of the attention. Sophie tried to calm him, but her eyes sparkled with something darker. She saw opportunity, not shame. She muttered about new followers, about Grandpa's comeback being good for her numbers. Their greed and ego clashed, but both wanted control. That night, I sat at my table with the notebook open. Their voices still echoed in my ears, but I focused on the ink-stained pages. I thought of how many times they had told me I was confused, unfit, irrelevant. Yet here I was, drawing up my counterattack, every step etched with the same precision. I once used to mark coordinates on a map. The breakthrough came when I convinced Max's junior technician to trust me. He was young, eager, more talkative than he should have been. I asked him to explain. The system pretended. I was just curious, just an old man fascinated by the scale of the screens. He smiled, happy to show off. In minutes, I knew more than I should have. The file formats, the upload deadlines, the schedule for when the Times Square screens were updated. He didn't realize he had handed me the keys. I spent the next week preparing. On the outside, I shuffled slowly, let Sophie record me struggling with a grocery bag, let Eric rant about responsibility. I played their game, gave them the performance they wanted. But at night, I pieced together my real performance, one they would never see coming. Max's campaign required me to sign off on the master file. He sent it over with pride, the image of me stoic and faded, text hovering above, resilient, silent. Forgotten no more. I stared at it, bile rising in my throat. It wasn't me. It was a product, a shell. I took that file, copied it, and replaced it with my own creation. Mine wasn't polished, it wasn't softened, it was raw. It showed my face, sharpened and unbroken. It displayed my own words, carved. From memory, the names of my unit, the dates, the battles, and below it, I added one line, simple and direct. They said I was broken. I remember everything. The night before the launch, I barely slept. The notebook sat on the table, open names staring back at me. My hands trembled not with fear, but with the weight of what I was about to do. I thought of my wife, gone too soon. I thought of my granddaughter, who had chosen the easy bribe over loyalty. I thought of my son, who saw me as an obstacle instead of a father. And I knew this was the only way left to reclaim what they had stripped from me when morning came. I walked through Times Square as a nobody. The crowd pressed around me, screens blaring ads for soda, cars, Broadway shows. People hurried past without looking twice at the old man in their midst. I stood still, clutching the notebook in my pocket, waiting for the hour to strike. The screen flickered. For a moment, Max's polished campaign appeared. My face blurred, softened, made into a symbol of pity. Then it cut. The crowd gasped as the image shifted, replaced by the version I had planted. My real face filled the tower, sharper than anyone expected, eyes blazing. The names rolled across the display like a roster of ghosts come back to life. People stopped, craning their necks, phones snapping pictures, and then the line appeared. They said I was broken. I remember everything. The air seemed to crack open. Strangers murmured, pointed, some clapped. A ripple of recognition moved through the crowd as they realized this wasn't another ad. This was a man refusing to disappear. I felt my chest expand, not with pride, but with something deeper — vindication. Somewhere behind me, I knew Max would be raging. Somewhere uptown, Eric would be watching, his grip on power slipping through his fingers. Sophie would scramble to spin the story, but no filter could rewrite what thousands had just seen with their own eyes. I stood there, anonymous in the crowd, watching myself larger than life above the busiest street in the country. They had tried to erase me, to make me small, to use me as their pawn. Instead, I had taken their stage and made it mine. The billboard blazed. The names shone, and for the first time in years, I felt the ground steady beneath my feet. The war wasn't over. But for the first time, I knew I wasn't fighting alone. The night my face lit up Times Square, I felt the tide shift. The crowd had gasped, cameras had clicked, strangers had cheered. But the true aftershock didn't come from the lights or the noise. Came the next morning, when the newspapers and online feeds carried my face. Not Max's version, not Sophie's clips, but mine. Veteran fights back against family exploitation. Elderly man outsmarts his guardians. They called me a symbol, a survivor, a man refusing to fade. I hadn't asked for any of those titles. What I wanted was simpler. Proof that I wasn't the broken figure they painted me to be. When I walked back through my neighborhood that day, eyes followed me. Some nodded respectfully. Some whispered, unsure what to believe. And then came Martha Reynolds, the neighbor who had poisoned half the street against me. She stood at her gate with her arms folded, lips pursed tight, like she had swallowed her own gossip and it burned going down. Didn't think you could manage all that on your own, she sneered. Must have been luck. I looked her in the eye, steady, and said nothing. Silence worked better than denial. She couldn't spread lies without someone to argue with, but Eric didn't stay silent. He stormed into my house 2 hours later, his face blotched red, his words slamming against the walls. You ruined everything. Do you know what this does to me? To Sophie? To Harper? His anger wasn't about me, it was about the crumbling of his story. He grabbed at the notebook on my table, the one with the names, but I pulled it back before his hand closed around it. For a second, his eyes flickered with fear, not of me, but of what I had left that he couldn't control. Sophie arrived not long after, phone in hand, recording as she spoke sweetly to her followers about a tough day supporting Grandpa. I could hear her rehearsed tone, syrup dripping. Over poison. She thought she could spin even this, turn my stand into her content. But her mask cracked when she lowered the phone. You think the world cares about your old war stories? She hissed. They'll forget you by next week. But me, I know how to keep an audience. Her nails tapped against the phone case, sharp, deliberate. She didn't understand the audience wasn't what I wanted. The truth was, Harper came later, her voice softer, almost apologetic. She asked if we could talk. She said she hadn't. Meant to hurt me, that she just wanted opportunities her parents promised. She said she was proud when she saw me on the screen. I listened, but I remembered her slipping my notebook across the table to Eric, her fingers closing around the bribe. I told her, pride is easy when you don't pay the cost. She cried, but her tears didn't land where they used to. The next move came from outside the family. A reporter knocked on my door, notebook in hand, asking for my side. I thought of refusing, but then I remembered all the times I had been spoken over, written off, so I told him. Not every detail, not every betrayal, but enough. I told him how my son filed papers declaring me incompetent, how my doctor signed them, how my own granddaughter handed over the only proof of my clarity. He wrote it down carefully, as though each word weighed more than the ink. The article spread, faster than Sophie's videos ever had. People saw the contrast her curated image of support next to the reality of legal manipulation. Questions poured in. Why would a doctor certify Alzheimer's without a thorough exam? Why would a son rush to seize his father's accounts? Why would a neighbor claim abandonment without evidence? Their scheme was unraveling. Not because I shouted louder, but because I stood still while their lies collapsed on their own weight. Max called me, furious and thrilled at once. "Do you know what you've done? You hijacked my campaign, but it worked. Clients are asking about you. Media wants interviews. Hell, you're trending." He wanted me to sign with him officially, to milk this moment until it turned into dollars. I told him no. He laughed like I was joking, but I wasn't. I hadn't clawed back my dignity just to rent it out. Eric wasn't laughing. He started sending letters from his lawyer, demanding I step down from managing my own finances, claiming the stress of publicity was proof of instability. He didn't understand that every paper trail he created was now evidence of his desperation. Dr. Patel avoided me, his silence louder than words. He knew the signature he placed on those forms was now a target. He couldn't undo it, and he couldn't defend it without exposing the cracks. I realized then that the fight was no longer private. It had spilled into the open, where shadows couldn't protect them. And that was exactly where I wanted it. I returned to Times Square one evening, blending into the crowd again. My image was still there, scheduled to run for weeks. I watched strangers stop, point, read the line below. My face. Some nodded, some clapped, some just stared. I wasn't looking for their approval. I was measuring the scale of what Eric had lost. Every screen that carried my story was another door closing on his narrative. That night, I made one final adjustment. I used the same loophole Max had left, the same process his technician had bragged about, to prepare the next broadcast. This time, it wasn't just my face or my words. It was documents. Copies of the guardianship papers with Eric's name highlighted. Dr. Patel's rushed signature exposed, the deed transfer forms he had tried to sneak through. I paired them with my own words, steady and unshaken. They said I was unfit. The only ones unfit are those who profit from betrayal. When the screen lit up with those files, the crowd didn't just gasp, they erupted. Phones went high, voices rose, the air turned electric. This wasn't a story anymore. It was proof. It was evidence, impossible to spin into sympathy or followers. Eric's ambition had become his noose, and I had handed the rope to the public. I walked away before the cycle finished, before the last line faded. The noise of the crowd followed me down the block, but I didn't need to stay. I had done what I came to do. The rest would unfold on its own, for the first time in years. I slept through the night without waking to doubt gnawing at me. My notebook rested on the table, pages open, names steady. They had tried to take everything from me, my house, my money, my dignity. But they couldn't take my memory. And in the end, it was my memory that undid them. The war was almost over. But the final strike was yet to come. The morning after Times Square, I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing non-stop. Reporters, lawyers, strangers who had watched me reclaim my voice, all of them wanted a piece. But before I answered a single call, there was a knock at my door. 2 men in dark suits stood outside, badges raised. FBI, they didn't need to explain much. I already knew. Eric's desperate rush to seize my accounts, the falsified guardianship filings, the fraudulent deed transfers. My son had left a trail too sloppy for Washington to ignore. They asked if I would cooperate. I said yes, and for the first time in months, my agreement wasn't extracted under duress. I showed them the copies I'd displayed in Times Square, the originals tucked safely in my desk. They flipped through each page, nodding, their faces steady but their eyes sharp. When they left, they promised I wouldn't be the one standing trial. By evening, Eric's house was surrounded by black cars. Neighbors gathered in clusters, whispering as agents carried boxes of files and computers out the front door. Sophie shouted from the porch, phone raised high, live streaming even as her husband was led into the car in handcuffs. "This is unfair. This is persecution," she cried. But the comments scrolling across her screen didn't support her. They mocked her, questioned her, told her she had built her own cage. Harper wasn't outside. I heard she had been sent away, quietly, tucked into some program overseas before the storm broke. I wondered if she scrolled through her feed that night, if she saw her father's face plastered under the word fraud. I wondered if she understood what loyalty really cost. Dr. Patel folded faster than I expected. He issued a statement to the press, saying he had been pressured by Eric to sign documents he knew weren't sound. He tried to paint himself as a victim, caught between loyalty to a patient and manipulation by the family. It didn't matter. His license was suspended within days. The quiet authority he once held in our community vanished like smoke. And Martha Reynolds, she locked her doors, closed her curtains, and for the first time in years, her mouth went still. The woman who had carried Eric's lies across fences and porches now kept her head down, as if silence could erase her part. It couldn't, but I didn't need her to admit anything. Her punishment was simpler. She no longer had an audience. Max called again, this time less cocky. "Walter, you're national news, but it's burning hot and fast. You need someone like me to manage the fallout, to keep you from fading." His pitch was smoother now, less about glory, more about protecting my legacy. I listened, then told him the same thing I had told Eric. I don't hand over what I bled for. He didn't argue. He knew the tide had shifted beyond his control. 2. I didn't celebrate. When Eric's face flashed on the news, when Sophie's brand collapsed, when Martha disappeared from her own lawn, I felt no triumph. Just an emptiness where a father's pride should have been. The war was over, yes, but there were no victors, only survivors. That night, I sat with my old notebook, the one filled with names of men who had stood beside me in jungles and deserts. Decades ago, I traced the letters slowly, not to remember because I hadn't forgotten, but to remind myself what real loyalty looked like. My blood family had abandoned me, but my chosen family had never wavered, even in memory. 2 weeks later, a van pulled up outside my house. The side door slid open, and there they were, 3 old Marines, backs bent, hands scarred, eyes sharp. We saw the billboard, one said with a grin, "Figured you could use some company." They weren't offering pity. They were offering a way out. I packed light. Clothes, my notebook, a few essentials. I didn't leave a note. There was nothing left to explain. As the van rolled out of the cul-de-sac, I watched the house grow smaller in the rear window. The home I had built with my wife's laughter and my sweat was no longer mine. It had become a cage of betrayal, a monument to what family can destroy when greed rots the roots. I didn't want it back. The road stretched ahead, and for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of where it led. When I look back on it all now, I don't feel anger. Not even regret. Just clarity. Families don't always fracture in grand explosions. Sometimes they corrode quietly, choice by choice, until one day you find the foundation gone. Mine did. I gave decades of labor and sacrifice, believing blood, guaranteed loyalty. But loyalty isn't inherited. It's proven, day after day, in small acts of truth. Eric wanted control. Sophie wanted an audience. Harper wanted escape. None of them wanted me, not really. What I learned is this: people will strip you bare if they believe your silence makes it easy, and silence was my mistake. I let them narrate who I was, until strangers knew me only as a burden. When I finally spoke, not with words but with proof, the lies collapsed. Not because I was loud, but because I refused to vanish. So here's the lesson. Plain and cold, when your own house turns against you, stop begging to be let back in. Build a new house, even if its walls are nothing more than old comrades and worn notebooks. It will stand firmer than any mansion built on deceit to those of you watching, especially those who feel the weight of betrayal in your own bloodline. Don't mistake endurance for acceptance. You're allowed to walk away. You're allowed to carve dignity from the wreckage, even if it means starting over at 70-6. I survived by remembering that my life was never theirs to define, and neither is yours. If my story gave you even a spark of strength, stay with me for the next. More voices deserve to be heard, and together we'll make sure they are.